I think we should start. I was having such a good time talking, I forgot time is up, and so happy that all of you are here. My name is Bruce Knotts. I am the director of the Unitarian Universalist UN office, and we are very happy to have all of you here, right, and from the Department of Public Information, so thank you very much for coming. And this presentation today by Jessica Henderson fits very much into the initiative of Unitarian Universalists and also of the United Nations. The Unitarian Universalists have passed an action of immediate witness at our General Assembly on Black Lives Matter. And so the presentation you're about ready to hear fits very much into that context of combating racism. The United Nations in December declared this the decade of people of African descent, and looking at patterns of racism and discrimination against people of African descent around the world. And so this also is a UN issue. It's a UU issue, it's a UN issue, it's an issue that I think all of us care a lot about. And we're very happy that Jessica has done this research and will present it today. So we're very grateful that you're here with your mother and your brother and your friends. So thank you all for coming. Jessica she's starting her third year at Northeastern University, where she's majoring in biology. This project is part of Northeastern Scholars Independent Research Fellowship. Students who receive the fellowship embark on independent research projects with a faculty mentor and receive funds from the University Scholars Program. Jessica's faculty mentor is Dr. Richard O'Brien, who is head of Northeastern African American Institute. Jessica was born in New Jersey, moved to Los Angeles when she was 2 years old, which happens to be my hometown, and then moved to New Hampshire right before she started high school. Her dad is from Connecticut, and her mom, who's here, is from Guyana. Her family moved to Brooklyn when she was 15. She has a younger brother, Matthew, who's also here, who's a rising junior in high school. We didn't have this terminology when I was growing up. Rising juniors and rising seniors. I like it. It's really nice. Anyway. Though her passion is studying the brain, she's also interested in computer science. She learned how to code MATLAB, which I'm not even sure what it is, in a seminar she took last spring. She plans to go into grad school and study neuroscience. She would like to pursue a research-based career. She said she'll probably be in the university until she's after 40, and she'll be teaching. Anyway, please welcome Jessica Henderson.
Thank you all so much for coming. I've really been looking forward to this. So, the goal of my research project was to investigate the extent and implications of housing disparities in the United States and Guyana. Segregation is a well-studied topic in the U.S. and is visibly evident in most major cities. In Guyana, like most places in the Caribbean, diversity as well as a small white population has led some to declare the region a racial democracy, free from any form of discrimination. The purpose of my research about Guyana was to prove that racial disparities are very much present in the country. The purpose of my mortgage study was to show that segregation in the U.S. is not solely due to the wealth gap between whites and people of color, and that other factors including discrimination are involved. Guyana and the United States share similar histories as former British colonies, but are very different demographically. Through this project, I hope to show the global scale of racism, even in places with differing cultures and populations. So in my mortgage data study, I investigated whether wealth differences across racial lines can explain segregation in 3 U.S. cities. This is not a baseless claim. Wealth inequality has actually increased between whites and non-whites since the recession. According to a Pew Research study, the median wealth of white households was 13 times that of black households in 2013. which is the biggest gap since 1989. However, America's long history of housing discrimination challenges the claim that urban segregation is simply due to the wealth gap. In my study, I used a similar methodology to a Harvard Civil Rights Project by David J. Harris and Nancy McArdle. The study focused on Greater Boston and used mortgage data gathered between 1999 and 2001. In my own study, I used mortgage data disclosed between 2010 and 2013. I chose to focus on Boston proper as well as two new cities, Brooklyn and Baltimore. Under the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, financial institutions are required to publicize loan data. The data is available for download on the FFIEC's website and includes the loan amount, the race and ethnicity of the applicants, as well as the neighborhood census tract where the home was purchased. So following Harris and McArdle's method, I downloaded the data and obtained raw data on home purchase loans for owner-occupied 1 to 4 family units. I set a lower limit for loan amounts at $25,000 to try to eliminate soft loans and second mortgages. And I also removed loans that were denied and entries where race was not disclosed or not applicable. So after the edits, I had 17,000 entries from Baltimore, 22,000 from Boston, and 38,000 from Brooklyn. So next I wrote a program in MATLAB to analyze the data. I compiled what Harris and McArdle referred to as the metro share for each city. I organized the loans by amounts in intervals of $50,000 and determined the percentage of owners by race in each interval. I then multiplied each race's percent share by the number of homes within each loan amount interval for each neighborhood. These expected numbers were used to predict the distribution of home buyers across the city by race. The hypothesis of the predicted distribution was that mortgage amount alone determines where people choose to live. I then compared the predicted distribution to the actual number of owners within each neighborhood by race. So, for example, say that in Boston, of all the mortgage loans between $250,000 and $300,000, say 10% were taken out by Asian applicants. So it would follow that, say a neighborhood had 100 homes in that mortgage range, that it would have 10 Asian applicants, it's 10%. And the number 10 is the expected number for Asians in that neighborhood, and then the actual number is the observed number. So here I have an example which is in Brooklyn. And the FFIEC does not require the disclosure of down payment amounts. This means that two mortgages of the same value might be taken out for houses with very different price ranges depending on the loan-to-value ratio. But fortunately, the American Housing Survey collects median loan-to-value ratios by region and race. So following the Harvard Studies method, the median loan-to-value ratios for each region were used to calculate the down payments, and then they were added to the loan amounts for an estimate of the total home value. So here in the example, you can see the observed for all the different races in that one neighborhood, and then the expected, which, as I told you, was calculated from the metro share. And you can see that both of those values add up to the same amount, which is how I checked to make sure that it was correct. Okay, so the Harvard study just divided the observed and expected numbers, and that gave you a ratio. But I wanted to determine if the difference between the two numbers was statistically significant. So I used the chi-square test, and this test gives me a clear result as to whether the observed and expected amounts are significantly different rather than just arbitrarily choosing a cutoff ratio. And to check the accuracy, I made sure that the actual number of mortgages in each neighborhood was equal to the sum of the expected numbers based on each race's metro share. So in this example, you can see the chi-square values for each race. And a chi-square value that's over 7.82 means that there's a significant difference between the two numbers. So for all these, you can see all of them but one are well above 7.82, except the last one. And you can see that those two numbers are pretty close anyway. And then on the far right, I have the ratios. And the ratios are based on whether that race was over or underrepresented in that neighborhood. So blue means over and red red means under. So you can see for Asian, the observed was a lot larger than the expected, so they're overrepresented, so they're blue. But then the blacks were underrepresented in that neighborhood, so they're red. And then, like I said before, the chi-square value for white non-Hispanic was below 7.82, so that means that there wasn't a significant difference. So I just left those gray. So to visualize these disparities, I made a series of maps in Photoshop for each of the 3 US cities. So here you can see the map key that I used. If the chi-square value was not significant, then that neighborhood will be shown in gray, and then overrepresented blue under is red. And as the ratio gets bigger, then the color gets darker. So I'm going to start off with Boston. As Northeastern professor Barry Bluestone says in his housing report card, Greater Boston is in the middle of a housing shortage. Unlike Brooklyn and Baltimore, the number of new housing permits in Boston has declined over the past year, even as the population has increased. Housing cost burdens have also been on the rise, with 38% of owners paying more than 30% of their income for housing in between 2009 and 2013. The housing market is not equipped for Boston's changing demographics. Average household size has decreased throughout the nation, but in Boston, over 60% of all housing units have no more than 2 occupants. However, the largest housing stock is still the single-family home. And according to Professor Bluestone, the cost of construction and zoning restrictions in Boston make it exceptionally difficult to synchronize housing supply with housing demand. So here I just have a few stats for Boston. The average home price is very high at $1 million, and the majority of the population is white. So here are some of the first maps that I made. And again, blue means that that race is overrepresented in that neighborhood, and red means underrepresented. And here you can see a pattern that I found in all 3 of the cities, and the black and the white Hispanic maps are almost the exact reverse of each other. So if you see, like, the blue neighborhoods are the red neighborhoods in the white Hispanic. And again, the gray means that there wasn't a significant difference. So the number of houses that they bought was what you'd expect based on affordability. And here you can see another trend that I found, and that was that the Asian and the white maps had the most gray, which means that where they lived was more based on affordability. So it's important to realize that these maps don't show the demographics of each neighborhood. They show how movement into the neighborhood has looked over the past few years, and could serve as predictions for how the demographics of the neighborhood might change in the future. So for example, according to this map, white applicants were overrepresented in Hyde Park, which is this blue neighborhood right here. But however, according to the census data, this neighborhood is mostly black. So if the trend in this map continues, the white demographic will grow in the future. And as I'll show later on, this is also a good predictor for gentrification. So now moving on to Baltimore. The city of Baltimore has a severe lack of development. Baltimore used to be a large manufacturing city, especially aircraft during World War II. And at 622,000, Baltimore has less than half the population that it had during the 1940s. Now there are many vacant, boarded-up houses. And in 2005, federal judge Marvin J. Garbus ruled in Thompson versus Department of Housing and Urban Development that the HUD had violated the Fair Housing Act by failing to address racial segregation in Boston. He stated, quote, "Baltimore City should not be viewed as an island reservation for use as a container for all the poor of a contiguous region." And after the nationwide mortgage crisis, Wells Fargo agreed to pay millions of dollars to Baltimore residents who claimed that the bank steered minorities into subprime mortgages. And lead paint is also a major problem. According to a Washington Post article, the neighborhood of Sandtown in Baltimore has the highest childhood lead poisoning rate in the city. And Freddie Gray, an unarmed black man who was killed in police custody last April, was from Sandtown. and he was actually involved in a lawsuit where he alleged that he had been poisoned by lead paint. And here you can see some of the demographics for Baltimore. The average home price is much lower at $200,000, and the city is mostly black. So Baltimore has a long history of housing discrimination. In 1910, it was the first city to order the segregation of every residential block. Then in the 30s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew the infamous redlining maps, identifying neighborhoods with, quote, undesirable racial concentrations. Researchers at Virginia Commonwealth University's Center on Society and Health have found that Baltimore neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s still have lower rates of home ownership and college attainment and higher rates of poverty. And here you can see the redlining map from 1930 on the left, and then on the right is a modern map showing poverty, and you can see that poverty is concentrated in the same areas that were redlined. So here are the maps for Baltimore. You can see the same trend that I mentioned in Boston, where the areas that are blue for the black occupants are red for the white Hispanic occupants. And Freddie Gray lived in Sandtown, which is in Bolton Hill, right there. And you can see that black applicants were overrepresented in that area. And here again, with the same trend, that Asian and white maps had the most gray. So that means that where they chose to live was mostly based on affordability. Okay, so now moving on to Brooklyn. According to a Realty Track study, Brooklyn has the least affordable housing market in the United States, followed by San Francisco and Manhattan. Bloomberg Business reported that residents would need to devote 98% of the median income to afford payment on the median-priced home. In an interview, the vice president of Realty Track stated that home price growth has been driven by investors and other cash buyers who aren't as constrained by income. And here are the stats for Brooklyn. The average home price, $300,000, and it's the most populous city that I studied at 2.5 million. And blacks and whites make up about the same amount in the city. So here are the maps for Brooklyn. And again, they're pretty much the reverse of each other. And you might have noticed that the maps with the darkest colors and therefore the largest ratios were maps for black mortgage applicants. This is consistent with American sociological studies, which revealed that nationwide, segregation between blacks and whites is more severe than Asian white and Hispanic white segregation. Okay, and the Asian and white maps. There's been a lot of discussion about gentrification in East Brooklyn, and according to a New York Mag article, the median home prices of Bushwick and Bed-Stuy have roughly doubled since 2010. So some argue that gentrification brings better services and more businesses to depressed communities. But if changes are truly bringing new opportunities to local residents, that's not gentrification, that's community development. Gentrification occurs when housing costs increase, but incomes don't. Gentrification doesn't reduce poverty, it forces impoverished people to move somewhere else. So here on the white map, you can see in East Brooklyn, they're very overrepresented, especially in Cypress Hill. And even though these neighborhoods aren't white majority neighborhoods, they're still overrepresented because you can see there's a demographic change going on in those areas. Okay, so my research addresses a very specific question. To what extent can affordability differences across racial lines explain segregation? The answer is not much. As the data shows, other forces are at work besides the wealth gap. Segregation may be due to discriminatory steering, but it could also be due to people just choosing to live with people who look like them. The truth is probably a combination of both factors. This topic clearly needs to be researched more. But although the causes of segregation are contested, the negative consequences are clear. So now moving on to Guyana. Guyana is a small country in the northern coast of South America. This map shows all the member states of CARICOM, which is an organization of 15 Caribbean nations. And although it's on the continent, Guyana is considered to be part of the Caribbean region, along with Suriname and French Guyana. So Guyana, if you can't see, is down here, and that's Suriname and French Guyana. So besides the fact that I'm half Guyanese, I wanted to include Guyana in this project because of its similarities to the United States. Both countries are former British colonies with a heritage of African slavery. Guyana is a parliamentary democracy and a UN member state, and its capital is Georgetown. It's rich in natural resources, including bauxite and gold. There's also extensive forestry and agriculture in its largely uninhabited interior. However, Guyana is a very poor country and has one of the highest debt per capita ratios in the developing world. Guyana also suffers from a shrinking population with a net loss of 3,000 people between 2002 and 2012. But there's still hope for the future, as Guyana's many waterfalls are a huge untapped research for hydroelectric power. So Guyana was first settled some 11,000 years ago by the Walrus tribe, and later by the Caribs and Arawaks. They constructed these mounds that you see in this picture all over the interior, and they're designed to retain moisture in the soil after the flood season, and local farmers say that the mounds produce crops at 2 or 3 times the rate of conventional fertilizers. Guyana became a Dutch colony in 1598, and slavery was introduced in 1640. Plantations produce sugar, coffee, and cotton. So the statue in the middle picture depicts Cuffy, who was a famous slave who led a large-scale revolt in 1763. Guyana became a British colony in 1803, and slavery continued until 1838. After emancipation, the need for new labor sources led the British to hire Portuguese laborers and later East Indian indentured servants who endured conditions similar to slavery until the practice was abolished in 1917. So despite historical conflicts between the two groups, Afro and Indo-Guyanese worked together to fight British colonial rule. Politicians Chetty Jagan and Forbes Burnham united to found the People's Progressive Party in 1950. Jagan was elected chief minister, but his Marxist views prompted Britain to send in troops and impose an interim government. The People's Progressive Party then split along racial lines, with Burnham breaking off to form the People's National Congress to represent Afro-Caribbean interests. Racial polarization came to a head in the 60s with widespread striking, riots, and assassinations. Independence was achieved in 1966, but ethnic tensions are still a source of social unrest in the country. So one of the biggest differences between Guyana and the US is that the white population is very small. So you can see the total population is around 750,000, and Indo-Guyanese are currently, they make up the majority at 43%, followed by Afro-Guyanese at 30%. There are 9 Amerindian groups, and they make up about 130 communities in the forests and savannas of the interior. Afro-Guyanese live largely in the coastal regions and make up the majority of regions 4 and 10. So region 4 is there, and that's region 10. My mom's family is from Bartica, which is in region 4. Indo-Guyanese make up the majority of the article argued. Land titles are also a matter of economic importance. Residents who don't own titles to their lands can't sell it or use it as security for loans. Impoverished farmers without land titles can only cultivate their land for a bare livelihood. According to the 2002 census, regions 4 and 10, which are mostly inhabited by Afro-Guyanese, have the lowest percentages of land ownership. Floods are a common occurrence in Guyana, especially during the rainy season. Many homes are built on stilts, like the one pictured, and whether or not you own your home also plays a role in vulnerability to floods. A 1997 Sage Journal case study of Georgetown suburbs showed that owner-occupied homes were more likely to have raised yards, and this will help prevent flood damage. And of the 3 towns surveyed, rented and squatted land occupiers were less likely to have this security measure. Flooding leads to a variety of household problems, including school absence and health risks. As mentioned before, Afro-Guyanese areas tend to have lower land ownership. Afro-Guyanese are disproportionately affected by this issue, challenging the notion of racial democracy in the region. So now that I've talked about the extent of housing disparities in these two countries, I'm going to move on to the consequences of racial segregation. Though they have different demographics, Guyana and the U.S. share similar histories and share social ills associated with institutionalized racism. So, starting with the environment. Where people live affects every aspect of their livelihoods, including exposure to pollution. Although Amerindians in Guyana have more control over their land titles don't include bodies of water or subsoil resources. The government also reserves the right to evict Amerindian communities for large-scale mining projects. A 2006 UN Human Rights Survey reported that Amerindians are disproportionately affected by mercury and bacterial contamination of rivers, which is a consequence of mining activity. So this photo shows Amerindian women protesting gold mining in their community. Stronger land rights are vital for the health and well-being of the Amerindian community. So, moving back to Boston. Last year, a study by the University of Minnesota revealed that in the United States, nitrogen dioxide concentrations are 38% higher for non-whites than for white. NO2 is an airborne pollutant released by power plants and by car exhaust. According to the study, Boston is the fourth worst urban area in the country for racial disparities in NO2 exposure, after Newark, Philadelphia, and Bridgeport. NO2 causes serious health problems, including heart disease. The study estimates that lowering nitrogen dioxide exposure for non-whites to the same level as whites would prevent around 7,000 deaths per year. Unequal exposure to pollution has dire effects on minority city communities. So now moving on to education. As I mentioned before, school absenteeism may be linked to low home ownership rates for Afro-Guyanese, especially during the flood season. Amerindian groups are also disadvantaged in schooling, mostly due to the fact that their communities are very remote. Until recently, only primary education was offered in Guyana's interior, which is largely occupied by Amerindians. Some new secondary schools have been built since 2002, as the government has sponsored construction through the Poor Rural Communities Project. According to a Guyana Chronicle article, Guyana has achieved universal primary education. But in 2003, less than 13% of households in the interior had access to secondary education. The Amerindian community faces many challenges due to where they live, and the government must take direct action to reach them. So moving back to Brooklyn. Last year, a UCLA civil rights project found that New York City public school system is the most segregated in the country. In addition, New York teachers are more likely to move to schools with a higher percentage of white students. Housing discrimination is closely linked to school segregation. Currently, New York City students can choose neighborhood schools in their attendance zone or attend a school elsewhere. However, students who are able to choose a school outside their zone usually come from relatively affluent families, thereby increasing segregation. Minority community schools are known to have inferior facilities and teachers. New York City must specifically target minority students in order to address this problem. So, the last topic is policing. The Guyana Police Force has been known to commit extrajudicial killings, especially by the Target Special Squad. The United Nations Human Rights Committee recommended that the government investigate police killings, but the sheer volume of complaints makes progress slow. Commissioner of Police Henry Green estimates that formal complaints against the police are made up about once every 48 hours. And as you can see, these statistics clearly show that the Guyanese police disproportionately kill Afro-Guyanese. So moving back to the U.S., Black and Latino Americans commit crimes at about the same rate as white Americans, but they are arrested and incarcerated far more often. Residential segregation enables police to disproportionately target minority communities. We also often hear stories of blacks and Latinos being stopped and questioned for being in predominantly white neighborhoods. In Baltimore, over half of the police force does not live in the city, leading to a sense that they're outsiders. It's clear that where we live and what we look like affects how we're policed. History has shown that separate can never be equal. My mortgage study supports what Harris and McArdle concluded in 2004, that segregation is not simply due to the racial wealth gap. Other factors besides affordability must be contributing to where home buyers decide to live. Integration is not just a matter of time. Even as minorities increase in number and wealth, segregation within and without cities across the world persists. Redlining in the U.S. and the lack of land rights for Afro-Guyanese are just two examples of institutionalized housing discrimination. Racism is not just perpetrated by individuals. It is a system of state violence that profits from the subjugation of black and brown bodies. Whether it's by a police officer's bullet or a premature heart attack, urban segregation is ending lives. We must acknowledge and address these issues because this is our home. Humanity shares a collective responsibility in combating racism. Thank you.